There are voices that visit us in childhood that carry the weight of eternity, presences that speak in symbols, dreams, and knowing without learning. Tonight, I want to take you back to that mystical threshold, because what if the voice you thought you outgrew was never meant to be abandoned? What if it was your soul's first and purest attempt to guide you home to yourself? She was 7 when she first heard it, not with her ears, but with something deeper. Sitting in her grandmother's garden, staring at the way sunlight filtered through ancient oak leaves, a voice that wasn't quite a voice whispered, "Remember this moment. You'll need it when you're older." The child didn't understand then. How could she? But 30 years later, in the middle of a divorce that was tearing her apart, she found herself sitting under another oak tree, and suddenly she knew that voice had been preparing her for this exact moment of breaking open. Carl Jung spoke of what he called big dreams, those childhood experiences that carry archetypal weight, messages from the collective unconscious that transcend personal memory. But Jung went further than most dare to go. He suggested that certain childhood experiences aren't memories at all, but encounters with what he called the eternal child within us, the part of the psyche that remains connected to the cosmic source. Modern neuroscience has discovered something extraordinary. The child's brain operates in a predominantly theta state, the same brainwave frequency associated with deep meditation, shamanic journeying, and mystical experiences. What if childhood isn't just a developmental phase, but a neurospiritual portal where the boundaries between the seen and unseen worlds are naturally thin? Think back to your own childhood, not to the documented moments, but to those strange unnamed experiences that live in your body like sacred secrets. The conversation you had with the moon, the way certain rooms felt alive with presence, the imaginary friend who knew things no imaginary friend should know. Dr. Stuart Hameroff's research into quantum consciousness suggests that the developing brain may actually be more sensitive to what he calls quantum information fields, subtle energetic patterns that carry wisdom from beyond individual experience. Children, with their neural pathways still forming and their rational filters not yet solidified, might be natural receivers of what ancient traditions called the Akashic records. The Lakota tradition speaks of children as still walking between worlds. But somewhere between learning to read and learning to doubt, something closes. The voice grows fainter. The invisible friends fade. We call this growing up. But what if it's actually a form of spiritual amnesia, a forgetting so complete that we begin to believe the magic was never real at all? In the deepest chambers of analytical psychology lies a figure Jung barely dared to fully explore, the divine child archetype, not as symbol, but as living presence. This isn't the sentimental image of childhood innocence we're comfortable with. This is something far more ancient and unsettling. The child as oracle, as bridge between worlds, as the soul's original voice before it learned to whisper. His name was Marcus, and he appeared to her every night between ages 4 and 6. Not in dreams, in the space between waking and sleeping, sitting at the foot of her bed with eyes that held starlight. Marcus never spoke in words, but in images that bloomed inside her mind like flowers opening in fast forward. He showed her things. A woman crying in a room she'd never seen, a tree with roots that reached down to touch the center of the earth, a door that led to a place where all the lost things waited to be found. Her parents, concerned about her overactive imagination, took her to child psychologists who assured them this was normal developmental behavior. The imaginary friend phase would pass, and it did. By age 7, Marcus had faded like morning mist, leaving behind only a strange, hollow feeling and a persistent sense that she had lost something precious. 40 years later, during a guided meditation retreat, she encountered him again. Same starlight eyes, same wordless communication, but this time, she understood. Marcus had never been separate from her. He was her soul's attempt to communicate through the only language available to a child, pure symbol and image. In Jungian psychology, the divine child represents the potential for renewal, for connection to source, for wisdom that exists outside of learned experience. But what if this archetype isn't just a psychological concept? What if it's an actual psychic structure that functions as an antenna for transpersonal information? The mystic Hildegard of Bingen wrote of receiving her first visions at age 3, not as supernatural phenomena, but as the living light speaking through the natural receptivity of the undefended child mind. The Sufi tradition speaks of the original face, the pure essence we carry before conditioning shapes us into separate beings. Children, they say, wear this original face openly, which is why they can see angels and speak with trees. Recent research in developmental psychology has identified what Dr. Alison Gopnik calls the lantern consciousness of childhood, a broad, receptive awareness that takes in everything without the selective filtering of adult attention. This isn't simply developmental immaturity. It's a fundamentally different way of processing reality that may be naturally attuned to subtle information fields. Consider the child who insists on talking to their deceased grandmother, providing specific details about conversations no living person could have taught them. Consider the child who draws pictures of places they've never been, but which turn out to be exact replicas of ancestral homes. Consider the child who speaks in their sleep in languages they've never heard, saying things that sound like prayers or prophecies. We dismiss these as coincidence or imagination because accepting them as real would require us to expand our understanding of consciousness itself. But what if the child's mind, unencumbered by the rational filters that develop with age, is simply a clearer window into the interconnected nature of all existence? Deep within the substrate of memory lies something that doesn't quite fit our understanding of how memory works. These are the moments that feel carved from different material, crystalline, eternal, carrying meaning that expands rather than diminishes with time. They arrive bearing gifts we don't yet know how to unwrap. The scent of jasmine that makes you weep for no reason you can name. The sound of wind chimes that opens a door in your chest you didn't know existed. The neuroplasticity of the developing brain may serve purposes beyond adaptation and learning. Dr. Bruce Lipton's research suggests that children's brains are in a constant state of downloading information, not just from their immediate environment, but from what he calls morphic fields, patterns of information that exist in the quantum field of consciousness itself. Between birth and age 7, children's brains operate primarily in theta brainwave patterns, the same frequency associated with deep meditation and mystical experiences. The child's mind becomes what shamanic traditions call a hollow bone, an empty vessel, through which information from expanded dimensions of reality can flow. Not all childhood mystical experiences come wrapped in beauty. Sometimes the soul speaks through the language of pain, encoding difficult messages in emotional experiences that won't be understood until much later. The child who feels inexplicably sad during family celebrations. The child who recoils from certain adults for reasons they can't articulate. The child who carries guilt for things they didn't do, fear of punishments they've never received. Traditional psychology explains these as developmental irregularities, the result of environmental factors or genetic predispositions. But depth psychology suggests another possibility, that some childhood emotional experiences are actually encoded messages from the unconscious, riddles wrapped in feeling that will only be solved when the adult is ready to receive their wisdom. He was 8 when the migraines started, crushing headaches that would arrive without warning and leave him writhing in darkness for hours. Medical tests revealed nothing. Child psychologists found no trauma, no obvious triggers. But during the headaches, something strange would happen. He would see images, not with his eyes, but imprinted directly onto his consciousness. Images of a man in uniform, crying. Images of a battlefield, bodies scattered like broken dolls. Images of a woman receiving a telegram, her knees buckling as she read. The headaches continued throughout his childhood, then mysteriously stopped when he turned 18. It wasn't until his 30s, during a family history research project, that he discovered his great-grandfather had died in World War I, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a legacy of unprocessed grief that had rippled through the family line like an underground river. The headaches, he realized, had been carrying his ancestors' pain, not as pathology, but as information. His child self had been unknowingly processing trauma that existed in the family's energetic field, transmuting inherited anguish through his own nervous system. What looked like suffering was actually a form of unconscious service, a mystical absorption of ancestral wounds. Marion Woodman, the renowned Jungian analyst, wrote extensively about what she called the wisdom of the wounded child, the way certain childhood experiences of pain or displacement actually serve to develop psychic sensitivity and depth of soul. These children, she suggested, are often shamanic children, beings who incarnate with the specific purpose of metabolizing family or cultural shadow material. There comes a moment in every mystical childhood when the magic begins to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, like a radio signal growing weaker, until finally there's only static. The imaginary friends stop visiting. The dreams become ordinary. The sense of living in an enchanted world gives way to the harsh, fluorescent light of consensus reality. We call this growing up, but it feels more like dying, the death of a part of ourselves that knew how to speak with invisible presences and read the secret language written in shadows and light. The process is so subtle we barely notice it happening. First, the adults around us begin to smile a little too knowingly when we mention our invisible friends. Then come the gentle corrections. That's just your imagination, sweetheart. Dreams aren't real. You need to focus on the real world now. Each dismissal is a small death, a closing of perceptual doors that once opened onto infinite vistas. The child learns quickly that certain experiences must be kept secret, that certain ways of knowing are not welcome in the bright, reasonable world of adults. And so begins the long exile from our own inner wisdom. Dr. Gabor Mate's research into the neurobiology of attachment reveals how children will instinctively abandon authentic parts of themselves to maintain connection with their caregivers. If expressing mystical experiences or intuitive knowing threatens the attachment bond, the child's survival instincts will override their spiritual instincts. The cost of belonging becomes the suppression of being. She stopped talking about her conversations with animals when she was 9, after her teacher suggested to her parents that she might need social adjustment counseling. The conversations didn't stop immediately. The neighborhood cat still came to sit with her when she was sad, and the old oak tree in her backyard still whispered comfort when she pressed her ear to its bark. But she learned to keep these experiences locked away, hidden even from herself. By adolescence, the lock had grown so strong that she could no longer remember what the animals had told her, or what wisdom the tree had shared. The mystical child within her had been successfully socialized into silence. She learned to navigate the world through logic and analysis, achieving academic success and social acceptance. But always, in the quiet moments, she felt a profound loneliness, the isolation of a being cut off from its source. The developmental imperative to belong is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. From an evolutionary perspective, belonging to the tribe meant survival. Exile meant death. This ancient programming still runs deep in our nervous systems, compelling us to conform to group norms, even when those norms require us to abandon essential parts of ourselves. In our culture, growing up is synonymous with learning to distrust inner experience in favor of external validation. We're taught to value empirical evidence over intuitive knowing, rational analysis over symbolic understanding, material success over spiritual connection. The child who sees auras around people learns to ignore them. The child who predicts events through dreams learns to dismiss them as coincidence. The child who feels the emotional residue in objects learns to pretend that objects are lifeless. Joseph Campbell, in his work on the hero's journey, identified this process as the first stage of initiation, the departure from the ordinary world of childhood into the wasteland of disconnected adulthood. But Campbell also recognized that this separation, while necessary for psychological development, was never meant to be permanent. The hero's journey leads eventually to return, to the recovery of the magical worldview of childhood, but now integrated with adult wisdom and capacity. Most of us, however, never complete the return journey. We remain exiled in the rational wasteland, successful by external measures, but haunted by a persistent sense that we've lost something essential. We medicate the loneliness with achievements, relationships, substances, distractions, anything to fill the void left by the departed mystical child. But what if that child never actually left? What if it simply went into hiding, waiting for the moment when it would be safe to speak again? In the hidden chambers of memory, certain dreams persist with the tenacity of ancient artifacts. These are not the processing dreams of daily experience, but something altogether different. Transmissions that arrive bearing the seal of eternity, dreams that feel more real than waking life and continue to unfold their meanings decades after first reception. The dream always began the same way. She was standing at the edge of a vast desert, holding a key made of light. In the distance, barely visible through heat mirages, stood a temple that seemed to be built from crystallized music. Every time she tried to walk toward it, the temple would recede, always maintaining the same impossible distance. But in the dream, she wasn't frustrated. She understood that the walking itself was the purpose. She had this dream repeatedly from age 6 to age 10, then never again. But the images stayed with her with perfect clarity, more vivid than most actual childhood memories. In her 30s, while studying Jung's work on active imagination, she realized the temple wasn't a destination, but a symbol of her own sacred space. The endless walking was the lifelong journey of approaching the mystery of her own depths. Dr. Day. Kelly Bulkley's research reveals that children's dreams often contain symbolic content beyond their developmental capacity to create. Archetypal symbols like spirals, mandalas, cosmic landscapes that children describe with startling precision, despite having no conscious exposure to such imagery. The boy dreamed of wolves every night for 2 years. Not ordinary wolves, but wolves with stars in their fur and eyes, like deep wells. In the dreams, he wasn't afraid. He was one of them, running through forests that sparkled with inner light, communicating through howls that carried ancient songs. His parents, concerned about violent imagery, tried to discourage the dreams by removing wolf-related books from his room, but the dreams persisted with such intensity that he would sometimes wake with the taste of starlight on his tongue. In his 20s, struggling with depression and disconnection from his own masculinity, he encountered Clarissa Pinkola Esté's work on the wild man archetype. The wolves, he realized, had been carriers of his authentic masculine essence, wild, connected to natural rhythms, unashamed of instinctual nature. The stars in their fur represented the cosmic dimension of masculinity, not aggressive domination, but fierce protector energy that serves life and beauty. Perhaps the wolves were there to remind, instinct too is light. Modern depth psychology recognizes that recurring childhood images often function as prospective symbols, images containing information about the soul's intended direction, like seeds carrying the blueprint of the tree they will become. In the archaeology of the psyche, there are wounds that serve as doorways and breaks that function as openings. Not all childhood trauma is simply pathology to be healed. Sometimes it's the soul's way of creating the cracks through which light can enter, the precise breaks that will later allow for a more expansive wholeness. The day her father left, something more than a family broke. She was 7, standing at the kitchen window watching his car disappear around the corner, when she felt it, a door inside her chest slamming shut with such finality that she could barely breathe. With that door went the voices. The conversations with her grandmother's spirit stopped. The ability to know things before they happened faded. The sense of being accompanied by invisible guides became a memory of a memory. For years, she would try to force the door open through meditation, therapy, spiritual practices, psychedelic journeys. But the door remained stubbornly closed, sealed by the same protective mechanism that had shut it in the first place. Her child self's instinctive response to overwhelming emotional pain. Dr. Peter Levine's work on somatic trauma therapy reveals how the nervous system, when overwhelmed, will shut down not just emotional processing, but also subtle perceptual abilities. The polyvagal nervous system, responsible for our sense of safety and connection, goes into protective mode, closing off the receptive channels that make mystical experience possible. But Levine also discovered something hopeful. The same nervous system that closes these channels can learn to reopen them. Through careful attention to somatic sensation and the gradual restoration of nervous system regulation, the doors that trauma closed can slowly, gently be reopened. The path back to the mystical child doesn't require forgetting adulthood or regressing to an earlier developmental stage. Instead, it asks us to create a bridge between the wisdom we've gained through living and the receptive innocence we once possessed naturally. Jung's technique of active imagination offers one such bridge. Unlike passive visualization, active imagination involves entering into dialogue with the autonomous figures of the psyche, allowing them to speak, move, and act independently of conscious direction. For many adults, the first figures to emerge in active imagination are childhood guides or presences that have been waiting patiently in the wings of consciousness for decades. She began the practice reluctantly, skeptical of anything that seemed too magical for her pragmatic adult mind. But when she closed her eyes and asked if anyone wanted to communicate, a familiar presence stirred. Marcus, her childhood guide, looking exactly as he had 40 years earlier, but somehow more solid, more real. "Where have you been?" she asked him in the imaginal space. "I've been here," he replied, not in words but in direct knowing. "You're the one who went away." Over months of regular dialogue, Marcus became not just a nostalgic childhood memory, but an active guide helping her navigate present-day challenges. The child self who had known how to listen to invisible guides was being reborn within the woman who had learned how to think and analyze. Sometimes the most profound teachings arrive disguised as ordinary human stories. These are not parables constructed to illustrate spiritual principles, but real encounters with the mystery that borders our daily lives, moments when the veil between worlds grows thin enough for truth to slip through. Margaret was 47 when Elena returned. She had built a successful career as a corporate lawyer, survived a difficult divorce, and considered herself thoroughly grounded in reality. The last thing she expected was to find herself once again in conversation with the wise woman who had visited her dreams throughout childhood. Elena looked exactly as Margaret remembered her: ageless features, silver hair braided with starlight, eyes that held depths of compassion Margaret had never encountered in waking life. In childhood, Elena had appeared during times of distress, offering wordless comfort. The dreams had stopped abruptly when Margaret turned 11, dismissed eventually as coping mechanisms for family trauma. But now, Elena was back, appearing in dreams so vivid, they left Margaret shaken. This time, Elena wasn't offering comfort, but issuing challenges. What are you not saying that needs to be said? Why are you living smaller than your soul requires? During one particularly intense dream, Elena led Margaret to a mirror that reflected not her current appearance, but her child self. bright-eyed, curious, unafraid of invisible presences. "She's been waiting," Eleanor said simply. "She's been waiting for you to remember who you really are." Margaret woke with tears streaming and a decision crystallizing. Within 6 months, she had left her law practice to study depth psychology. Eleanor continues to appear in her dreams, not as fantasy, but as her soul's truest teacher. In the mythologies of many cultures, bridges appear as symbols of connection between different realms of existence. The Norse speak of Bifrost, the rainbow bridge connecting the world of humans to the realm of the gods. The Celts tell of bridges that appear only to those who know how to see them, allowing passage between the world of the living and the domain of the ancestors. But what if these aren't just mythological concepts? What if they're descriptions of an actual psychic structure that exists within human consciousness, an invisible bridge that connects our personal emotional history to the vast reservoir of ancestral and collective wisdom? This bridge, according to many shamanic traditions, is constructed from memory, both personal and transpersonal. The emotional experiences of childhood, particularly those that carry symbolic weight, form the bridge's foundation. These experiences create pathways in the psyche that can later serve as conduits for wisdom from broader dimensions of consciousness. The child who learns to comfort themselves by imagining conversations with a deceased grandparent is actually building a bridge to ancestral wisdom. The child who finds solace by talking to trees is constructing a connection to the intelligence of the natural world. The child who sees colors around people is developing a sensitivity to subtle energetic information. These bridges don't disappear when childhood ends. They simply become invisible to the rational adult mind, but they remain intact in the deeper layers of the psyche, waiting to be rediscovered when the adult is ready to receive their gifts. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's groundbreaking research into epigenetic trauma transmission has revealed that emotional experiences can actually be passed down through generations via changes in gene expression. The traumas of our ancestors live on in our cells, but so do their wisdom and resilience. The invisible bridge connects us not just to our personal childhood, but to the emotional and spiritual legacy of all those who came before us. In the deepest teachings of mystical traditions lies a recognition that disturbs our comfortable notions of identity. What we call self is actually a construction, a story we tell ourselves about who we are based on accumulated experiences, social conditioning, and protective adaptations. But beneath this constructed self lies something more fundamental, what the Sufis call the original face, what Hindu philosophy terms Atman, what Jung called the self, with a capital S. The revelation came during a meditation retreat, 23 years after Emma had last heard from Thomas, her childhood companion. She was sitting in silence when suddenly she found herself in familiar territory, the inner landscape where Thomas had once taken her on adventures through impossible worlds. But this time something was different. As Thomas approached her in the meditation, his face began to shift and change, and with a shock that sent her heart racing, Emma realized she was looking at herself, not her current adult self, but her essential self, the pure consciousness that existed before conditioning shaped her into a separate person. Thomas hadn't been an external guide at all. He had been her own soul speaking to her through the only language a child could understand, the language of imaginary friends and magical adventures. Every piece of wisdom he had shared, every comfort he had offered, every challenge he had presented had come from her own deepest knowing, filtered through the creative capacity of the child's mind. This recognition was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant she had been capable of profound wisdom all along, but had learned to distrust it. Liberating because it meant that wisdom was still there, still accessible, still her own. Rumi wrote, "You are not just the drop in the ocean, but the entire ocean in each drop." What if childhood mystical experiences aren't encounters with external beings, but glimpses of our own vast inner nature, the oceanic consciousness that exists before we learn to identify ourselves as separate drops, before we learn to doubt our own knowing, before we develop the complex filters of social acceptability and rational credibility, before we construct elaborate defenses against our own sensitivity. There is a brief window when the soul can speak directly through us without interference. This is why childhood mystical experiences often carry such profound authority. They emerge from a state of consciousness that hasn't yet learned to lie to itself. The child who insists they remember being in their mother's womb may actually be accessing cellular memory. The child who describes past lives in vivid detail may be tapping into what Jung called the collective unconscious. The child who predicts future events through dreams may be naturally attuned to the non-linear nature of time at quantum levels. But as we develop ego structure and social identity, these direct transmissions from the soul become increasingly filtered through layers of psychological defense. We learn to translate our mystical experiences into socially acceptable language, to doubt our own perceptions, to seek external validation for inner knowing. The journey back to the mystical child isn't about returning to naivety or abandoning adult discernment. It's about recovering the soul's natural capacity to speak directly through us, while maintaining the wisdom and stability we've gained through lived experience. This recovery often begins with a simple recognition: the voice you've been seeking outside yourself has been speaking inside you all along. The guide you've been waiting for is the one you've always been. The mystical experiences you long for are actually memories of your own deepest nature, calling you home to yourself. In the space between forgetting and remembering lies a revelation that can restructure our entire understanding of spiritual development. What if the mystical capacities of childhood don't actually disappear, but simply go underground, continuing to operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, waiting for conditions that will allow them to resurface? The practice begins with a question asked in genuine curiosity. What is trying to speak to me today? Not through grand mystical experiences, but through the subtle symbolic language that surrounds us constantly. The song that plays unexpectedly when you need to hear it, the animal that crosses your path at the moment of decision, the dream fragment that lingers with unusual persistence. Sarah began this practice after years of feeling spiritually dry. She started by simply noticing what captured her attention during her morning walk. On the third day, she found herself stopped before morning glories growing wild over a fence, their blue trumpets opening to catch sunlight. A memory surfaced, her childhood self planting morning glory seeds with her grandmother, while the old woman whispered, "These flowers know how to find the light, even when they're tangled in darkness." The practice of symbolic listening doesn't require belief in anything supernatural, only willingness to treat experience as meaningful rather than random. It's the recovery of what indigenous cultures call original instructions, the capacity to read the book of the world as our ancestors did. In linear time, childhood is something we've moved beyond, a developmental phase completed and left behind. But in the time of the soul, childhood isn't a past state but a perpetual present, a dimension of consciousness that remains eternally accessible because it represents our essential nature before conditioning. This is why practices like active imagination often spontaneously produce encounters with our child selves, and why healing work frequently involves dialogue with inner children of various ages. These aren't memories being recalled, but living aspects of our psyche that exist in the eternal now of the unconscious. The Vedantic tradition speaks of the witness consciousness, the part of us that observes all experience without being changed by it. This witness is often described as eternally childlike, not in the sense of immaturity, but in the sense of original freshness, natural wonder, and undefended openness to reality. When we speak of reconnecting with our inner child, we're not engaging in sentimental nostalgia, but accessing a living spiritual dimension that carries our original instructions for how to be human. The inner child knows things the adult has forgotten: how to play without purpose, how to love without conditions, how to be present without agenda, how to listen to voices that speak in whispers and symbols. Marcus, who had been visiting meditation students for decades, began to understand that his childhood guide wasn't a being from the past, but a timeless presence that existed outside ordinary temporal categories. In deep meditative states, he could access conversations with this guide that felt as immediate and relevant as if they were happening for the first time. The guide would speak about current life situations using the same symbolic language it had used when Marcus was 7, offering guidance through images, metaphors, and intuitive knowings that bypassed the analytical mind entirely. These weren't retrieved memories, but fresh communications from the dimension of consciousness that exists before and beyond personal history. The circle completes itself not through returning to childhood, but through bringing adult consciousness into service of the child's wisdom. This is the true maturation, not the abandonment of mystical sensitivity, but its integration with discernment, responsibility, and lived experience. Real emotional maturity, the sages tell us, isn't about outgrowing our sensitivity to subtle realities. It's about developing the capacity to hold these sensitivities within a stable, grounded adult consciousness. The mystical child within us was never meant to be abandoned, but to be given the protection, discernment, and practical skills that only adult development can provide. Consider the difference between a child who sees auras around people and becomes overwhelmed by the intensity of others' emotions, and an adult who maintains the same sensitivity but has learned healthy boundaries, energetic protection, and the wisdom to know when and how to share their perceptions. The gift is the same, the container has matured. This is what Jung meant by the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold opposing tensions in creative relationship. The rational adult and the mystical child don't have to be enemies. They can become allies in service of a more complete way of being human. Dr. Sarah dreaded parent-teacher conferences when her son was young, knowing the teachers would express concern about his overactive imagination and his tendency to have conversations with invisible friends. But she had learned from her own childhood to protect rather than pathologize these experiences. When 8-year-old Michael told her about his nighttime conversations with the light people who visit my room, she didn't dismiss them as dreams or fantasies. Instead, she asked questions. What do they tell you? How do they make you feel? What do you learn from them? Through these conversations, she learned that Michael's guides were teaching him about kindness, helping him process difficult emotions, and preparing him for challenges at school. Rather than shutting down these experiences, she helped him develop discernment about when and with whom to share them, taught him energetic protection techniques, and created a home environment where mystical experiences were honored rather than feared. Now in his 20s, Michael works as a counselor for troubled youth, using his natural sensitivity to create healing connections with kids whom other adults find difficult to reach. His childhood mystical experiences weren't a phase to be outgrown, but gifts to be refined and put in service of his life's work. What you called growing up was actually forgetting. What you call returning is actually remembering. The voice that spoke to you in childhood speaks still, in the space between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence that holds all sound. Tonight, before sleep, ask the question your childhood self once knew. What wants to speak to me? Your mystical child has been waiting for this invitation to speak again.